I am frequently asked to glue broken things around the house, and I bring a mobile glue kit with me when I go to the local repair cafe as a volunteer. So here's a video of some of the stuff that I bring for gluing purposes. I primarily use epoxy glue for most repairs, more so than I might use superglue. Advantages being that epoxy is gap filling, much better than superglue is, CA or cyanoacrylic glue being the proper designation. Epoxy glue is better at filling gaps. It's generally stronger, and it generally takes a little longer to set up to full strength, with a few exceptions. But it's very versatile once you get used to using it. It doesn't dry, it cures and turns into a hard sort of plastic with a chemical reaction. I've got some samples here that I'll mix together from JB Weld, which is a slow curing epoxy, to their fast version, which is JB Quick, that starts setting up in less than 10 minutes. Then I've got some 5-minute epoxy from Gorilla, which is relatively clear, and also some DevCon 210, which is a 2-ton, which is a very slow curing but extremely strong epoxy. They claim 2 drops will hold 2 tons of weight on an appropriate fitting surface if it's done correctly. So we'll just mix these up really quickly. You squeeze out roughly equal amounts of both adhesives, or both halves of the adhesive. There's a resin and there's a hardener. In the case of JB Weld, it's this color because it has powdered steel mixed in with the resin. The white liquid is the hardener. And although, like I said, this is a chemical reaction and they don't really cure on their own until they're well mixed, to some extent the hardeners of most epoxies can tend to get dry or gel a little bit with oxygen exposure if you don't use up the entire tube in a relatively short period of time, a year or two, let's say, depending how old it was when you bought it. This is our JB Weld. This is the JB Quick slower curing version, which we can demonstrate in the course of a short video. I've got the 2-ton DevCon, and this is the 5-minute epoxy. It happens in this case to be Gorilla brand, but there are others. I'd rather get DevCon or some other brand if I can. The epoxies here have the advantage of being clear, which might be better for an unobtrusive repair. At most, they will turn slightly yellow when mixed and or cured. Note that I always keep some popsicle sticks around for mixing glue, but you can use an old screwdriver or whatever, as long as it's something that you can either wipe off right after you mix the glue, or that you don't care if you throw it in the garbage. I've used butter knives and just cleaned them thoroughly afterward, but don't tell my wife. Some other epoxies that I keep around. Here's an instant set. That sets in like 90 seconds from the Superglue company. It works the same as the others. Mix equal amounts. It's kind of nice to have it in the syringes because you don't really have to guess about the amount. You just squeeze it out of the double syringe. But when the epoxy tends to gel, which you might be able to see, it has a little bit here. There's like some trapped air bubbles. that won't move, they won't go upwards, it can be tough to get the epoxy out of the tube. There is a trick for this, which is whether it's a plastic syringe-like tube like one of these, or it's in bottles, you can either warm it in the microwave for a very brief period of time, no more than 10 seconds. Probably best to do it for 5 or 6 seconds, check it, maybe do it for another 5 or 6 seconds. Or if it's in metal tubes, such as the JB Weld, which also has particles of steel in it, obviously you can't be putting any kind of metal into a microwave because you risk arcing from the reflected radio frequency energy. So you can put an epoxy, whether it's one of these tubes or this type of tube, into some really hot water and let it sit in hot water for 5 to 10 minutes. As long as the water can't get in where the epoxy is. The heat may soften it up if it's gelled a little bit and allow you to squeeze it out of the tube or out of the bottle. I can't swear that epoxy that gets a little old and starts to gel will have the same strength when it's cured, or that it will cure as quickly. But so far when I've used it, it has basically worked. There are also other types of epoxy that may be useful in some circumstances, such as what are known as plastic fusion epoxies. Now, these have solvents in them, typically something very unpleasant smelling, and they're supposed to be better for gluing plastic, or at least certain types of plastic. The trouble is that many of the plastics we might want to glue, such as polypropylene, polyethylene, and nylon, are pretty much glue-proof in most cases. Solvents don't generally affect them and soften them, and so even an epoxy glue with any kind of model airplane type solvents in it might not necessarily soften the plastic to where the glue will bond. I've probably had this for a couple of years and I really haven't used it, so that might tell you something. I don't know if it's any good anymore. There is also a super glue that on the surface of it, I thought was fairly normal when I bought it, except that I discovered the first time I used it at one of the repair cafes next to tables with the other volunteers, it smells. It smells really bad. It's got really strong chemical odor to it, and the other people at the repair cafe didn't care for doing that much indoors. So it may have been formulated for gluing plastics. I don't know. It didn't say such on the package, but I haven't really used it since that time. It's probably something you would want to do outside. Smelly solvents is unfortunately a side effect, or something that just comes along with gluing in some cases. So it's either that or throw the item out. You can make a determination as to which one is worse for the environment. I'm not really fond of Gorilla products. They seem to be more of a marketing company than a manufacturing company. My guess is that they probably have the glues made for them by someone else. I've tried their super glue and I don't much care for it. I have other types of super glue that I use that I prefer, which we will get into in a little bit. Now, just for ha-has, let's come take a look at our glues here. And I need a stick. And you'll see that the JB Fast is already fairly hard. I can touch it, it won't stick to my fingers. I can maybe leave a fingerprint in it. Now, full cure will take some hours, and they might tell you a few hours, but generally speaking, with any kind of epoxy, I would give it 12 hours at minimum. And if it's a slow cure, maybe 24. Now, this is a slow cure epoxy, and as you can see, it's still kind of liquid and runny. so you have more time to work with it, which may be helpful. And it's also somewhat stronger due to the slow cure. The way that the crystalline lattice forms when it turns into a plastic-like material makes it stronger. Generally speaking, the slower cure epoxies are going to be stronger. Here's some Gorilla Glue, 5 minute, still a little gummy. You can see it's kind of, like a syrupy honey sort of stuff. So you have a little more time to work with it. And then the DevCon is still quite liquid. This stuff will start to set up in like an hour. So if you're gluing something where you have to hold pieces together, you might want to use a 5-minute epoxy because you only have to hold it for a few minutes before it gets at least tacky enough to start holding the pieces together. Or you might want to use some of that blue or green painter's tape or frog tape or something like that to hold the pieces together and then peel them off once the epoxy has set sufficiently. Now, the other thing about epoxy, since it, will tend to drip and ooze, and you'll end up with some of it on the outside of the crack or the glued together pieces, most epoxies can be removed with alcohol fairly easily while they're soft. So I always keep a little bit of, denatured alcohol, some kind of pure alcohol. Rubbing alcohol sort of works, but it's got 10% water, so it's better to get something that's closer to 100% alcohol. And this on a Q-tip or a rag will usually take most of the traces off from around the edge of a crack or a seam where you've glued something. Once it sets up, there isn't much that'll affect it. Maybe some really strong solvents like mech or acetone, but you won't really be able to clean up the edges around something that you've glued after the epoxy has set, other than maybe scraping it away with a razor knife or some kind of dental pick, some kind of tool. So let's set this aside. And we'll bring out the CA glues, cyanoacrylate. Now, yes, I have some ordinary kind of supermarket type tubes of Superglue. I don't use them very often. They're a little bit thick. And as they get old, sometimes they will cure in the bottle or in the tube. This feels almost like a gel already, so I have a sneaking suspicion it's old. I don't think, did I open this? It's sealed, but it feels kind of rubbery, so it's probably no good. Suppose I could pop it open and find out. Yeah, see, it won't squeeze out of the bottle. This is a problem you get with Superglue when it's old, and manufacturers don't want you to know how old it is when you're buying it. So they rarely stamp it with any kind of date code that can be deciphered by ordinary people, and they don't necessarily give you a key online for how to do it. Here's some Gorilla Superglue. This feels a little more fluid. Suppose if I open it, let's see. There's a little, no, this one doesn't. Some tubes will have a built-in puncturing device built into the cap, but this one does not. So let's do this. That one had. Nope, won't fit. The tubes aren't all the same. So anyway, okay. You'll need a dental pick or a little screwdriver or a pin or something like that. See if this is any good. Yeah, it's liquid. Like I said, it's kind of thick. You can see how slowly it falls. Superglue, cyanoacrylate glue, doesn't dry. It's not something that dries in air as a solvent evaporates. It cures with exposure to moist air. It's the moisture that really causes the curing. If it was an absolutely dry environment, it probably would cure very slowly. Now, what I use a lot, rather than small tubes of glue, is I use these tight bond formulations. One of them is water thin, and the other one is a medium viscosity. The water thin is literally like water. So if you need to, for instance, kind of pre-assemble something and put it into a crack, capillary action will tend to suck it right into a small space or crack. You do have to be careful when you take some out of the bottle because it will drip immediately, okay? It's awesome for gluing your fingers together too, because of the fact that it's thin and it will run. Now you can always take some of this and suck it into a little squeezy pipette or other kind of syringe-like device. They also make a medium formula, still not gel-like, still thinner than, there you go. So you didn't flatten right out, it kind of slowly spreads out. You may not find these in the average hardware store, but of course you can buy them online, and it's a well-known brand. And they do sell them at some woodworker supply stores, such as Woodcraft. But I find these much more useful than the little tubes. Another thing that you can do with Superglue, grab another popsicle stick here, is it will react very quickly in a chemical reaction with certain things such as cellulose, wood pulp, wood fiber, cotton. You may have seen a cotton ball dunked into superglue or saturated with superglue, and it fumes, puts out really noxious fumes, and may even burst into flames. Okay, so don't breathe that if you play with it. You want to avoid breathing superglue fumes or getting them in your eyes. But this is baking soda. Baking soda, when hit with superglue, will turn into something more like quartz or glass or a hard plastic pretty quickly. It has an accelerant effect. You could glue something and sprinkle a little superglue on it perhaps, and as long as you don't care about the finish you get, it will start that superglue setting up really quickly. But what I can do, and this really only works well with the thin glue, is saturate this with the glue. It'll soak in. I don't know if you see it fuming a little. It's actually putting off fumes, which I am trying to avoid because I don't want to breathe them or get them in my face or eyes. But it will set up very quickly and become like a little, in this case, like a little boulder, a lump of stone. See how hard that is? Now, if you try this with thicker superglue of any variety, you'll probably have to do it in layers. A thin layer of baking soda and a thin layer of superglue, and build it up over time. It's kind of slow because the thin superglue will just sit on top of the powdered baking soda and it doesn't really soak in. But if you use the water thin stuff, it will. One of the repairs that guitarists like to do with this, if they're handy at fixing their own instruments, is if a piece of the guitar nut where the strings pass through by the first fret, or just above the first fret towards the tuners, if a piece of it chips off, you can actually fill that spot with baking soda, put a little bit of superglue on it, and in a little while you can actually file the notch back for the string, and the stuff is surprisingly tough and will last a long time. But like I said, that really only works with the thin superglue. Even the medium is kind of iffy for that. You know, I would use the water thin. Now, should you ever stick your fingers together with superglue, you probably want to have some debonder on hand. There are other brands. They're all solvents. Alcohol won't do it. As a matter of fact, alcohol can sometimes be an accelerant to make superglue set up faster. Something I'll get into in a minute. But this is a mixture of nitromethane, rocket fuel, for your old planes and cars in the days before we had battery-powered drones. And it's acetone and nitromethane. It will, unfortunately, like most solvents that you might use around superglue, damage painted or slippery glass surfaces in many cases. So it's really more for unsticking your fingers. If you're woodworking with it and you accidentally stick some small pieces of wood together prematurely or position them incorrectly when they go together, you might be able to use it for that. But it's definitely good to have around for your fingers. There are also superglue, CA glue, accelerants that will cure it really quickly. They're solvents. I've seen some that smell worse than others. This one notes that it may discolor granite or marble, but is perhaps okay for certain synthetic stones. But if you were gluing two pieces of wood and you wanted them to stick together immediately, you put the superglue on one side, you spray the other piece of wood with this, and when you pop them together, boom, they're stuck. I also like to keep a little bottle of JB brand Super Weld around. This has a little nail polish style cap and a brush, so it's good for dabbing small amounts. It's medium thickness, medium viscosity. Seems to work okay for certain things, for small repairs. Sometimes helpful because it's easy to work with. You don't have to be quite as careful with it as you do with the water-thin formulations from the bottle, but it's pretty good stuff. JB Weld generally makes good adhesives, although I will caution there have been a lot of consolidations in the adhesive and glue market in the last few years, with some companies selling off their product to other companies, selling a patent, and you see pretty much the same thing show up in a similar format but with a different brand. And so it's hard to tell. Here's an example. This is now a JB product. I cut this open. It came like that, and it had a built-in black nozzle on this end, and you can see the tube is in there, and you were supposed to squeeze the tube through the rubber. An earlier version, when this was originally developed by a company called Fiberfix, originally branded Fiberfix. They had a variation of this packing where there were levers on this side that you squeezed, which obviously wasn't very effective at squeezing a tube from the sides. Really stupid. You waste a lot of glue. You can't get all the glue out of the tube. And this stuff seems to cure in the tube fairly quickly once you open it, so it's not as long lasting to keep around. It's more of a fix a couple items and then it'll probably be gone if you don't use it all up. It will harden on you. Now you might wonder what this is. This is a UV flashlight, ultraviolet light. All right, and the purpose for it is this glue is formulated so that when you hit it with the ultraviolet light, it sets immediately, like within seconds. Okay, it accelerates the process. Instead of spraying a super glue with something like this, you just use the ultraviolet light. And this formulation of CA glue will start to harden in seconds. So it accelerates the process anywhere that the light can reach. Obviously, if you're gluing something that's kind of thick, if you got something ceramic and it's 1/4 inch thick, it's not going to cure down inside the joint. But because it is formulated similar to a regular super glue, it will cure on its own even in the absence of light. For all I know, it might cure in bright sunlight if the sunlight reaches into it too, but I can't swear to it. But anything with ultraviolet light will probably accelerate the curing. But anyway, you can start the cure on the outer edge really quickly with the light, and then the pieces will hold together until the rest of the glue cures. But it was a really terrible setup. It was kind of like this, and I very carefully cut them apart, and took this off. It was something where originally you tighten this down on here. It had like a ratchet mechanism. It would not come off again, and it would puncture the cap at the same time. But this is what the glue looks like. Doesn't have to be in the rubber. It's just a way to identify it so that it's not quite your ordinary super glue. And it costs a bit more. I think it was about $11 for this tube. There are other formulations of ultraviolet curing super glue, CA glues on the market. I haven't yet looked around and found anything online that I liked, but I'm sure if I look, I will find something. Now, the other UV type glue that I have is another one that I really like. This is called Rapid Fix. It's a resin. It's a similar consistency to an epoxy, but there's no mixing involved. And when you hit it with the ultraviolet light, as long as the light can hit the glue, it will harden into a, plastic material. Oops, sorry. In about 10, 15, 20 seconds, it'll be pretty much full cure or close to it. Moderate thickness, kind of syrupy. It glows a bit. It fluoresces like some minerals do when you hit it with ultraviolet light. And that will start curing. And in about 10 to 15 seconds, we'll find it becoming like a hard plastic. Let's see. Yeah, see, the feels slightly rubbery, but the dental pick is already kind of bouncing off of it. If I was to touch it, it would feel kind of warm. There's a bit of a chemical reaction. Epoxies will generate heat, which is why you don't want to mix a large amount of epoxy all at once, because sometimes it'll actually catch fire. I don't know that this would do it. I've never used enough of it in one swoop. But it's, like I said, it's already curing, as you can see. I can probably, I can nick it off of there. And we have like a little kind of a contact lens. So very useful. And sometimes it might be the kind of thing where you can hold pieces together with a little tacky bit of this on the outside that you zap with the light, and then peel it off later, because like many glues, certainly like epoxies, it really doesn't stick to things well unless they're roughed up and have a rough surface where the glue can get down into the pores. But for instance, like if I want to glue dividers into my parts drawers, my little pull-out plastic parts drawers, or, the ones with a hinge lid that you might use for parts or screws or fishing tackle, you can put this right where the dividers go down in the slots, put a couple of drops in there, hit it with the ultraviolet light, and in 10 minutes you can put your stuff, 10 seconds, you can put your stuff back in the tray, as opposed to if you use super glue and there might be a trace of super glue down on the bottom and you find that things are getting glued into the tray. It's relatively inexpensive. I've bought it online. I don't know if you find it in stores. There's a similar glue called Bondic that works pretty much the same. That's a little thicker. It costs a little more. It has a lousy sort of a rubbery tube for a dispenser. And I've also seen the Bondic gel and dry up inside the tube, even though it's a black tube and it's not supposed to be exposed to light. I have yet to see this stuff solidify or gel on its own. So it seems a better glue than the Bondic. All right, and a few other things. I usually have some silicone, which most of you are likely familiar with, silicone rubber type sealants. I want to correct some misinformation or a misunderstanding, especially for guys like me who have electronics background, work on old electronic equipment, amplifiers and things. RTV does not mean radio television. It means room temperature vulcanizing. It has absolutely nothing to do with it being particularly safe or non-corrosive for electrical or electronics. Pretty much all the silicones I've worked with that are any good will have some kind of a vinegar aroma and a vinegar type base. They'll usually say something like contains alkyl acetoxysilane and acetic acid. Acetic acid, which irritates eye, skin, and respiratory tract, is released during curing. Avoid breathing vapors. Okay, and this stuff, ethyl triacetoxysilane and methyl triacetoxysilane vapor. Acetic acid is evolved or produced when it cures. So acetic acid is vinegar. It's what gives vinegar the sharp taste and smell. And it can corrode metals such as copper. So if you're using it for electronics use, it might be okay to, if this was a capacitor, you might, put it around the base of the capacitor to hold it down against vibration and shock. But if it touches anything copper, a component lead, copper foils, can't guarantee that it won't corrode or even be conductive to some extent under certain circumstances. If you have to do something like that, you're better off if you've got two capacitors on a circuit board next to each other, just put some glue in between them. That won't hurt. Put some silicone between them, and they're soldered to the board, so they'll be braced against each other. Now, I also have some E6000. This is similar to goo or goop, shoe goo, similar type glue. It's transparent, rubbery. Has a pretty strong chemical smell. Most people won't like it. It smells like a dry cleaner's. It's got perchloroethylene in it. So if you're sensitive to solvents, well, either use something else or do it outside. But it's rubbery, it's tough, it's stronger than a silicone. I understand that people use it a lot for hobbies and crafts. So it might be something to keep in your arsenal. I find that at the repair cafe it's sometimes useful. Although again, it won't set up for an hour or two. It'll start skinning over in 10 minutes like silicone does, but full cure may take a half a day or a full day, depending how much air gets around it. Now, a couple other things I always keep, like I said, Q-tips and alcohol for cleaning excess glue before it cures, excess epoxy anyway.